the return because we've had several returns. This is the real one though. Like I'm not joking. This is the real return of the official podcast of sorts, not just coaching calls. I do like posting those coaching calls um, into the podcast so you can actually hear how things go uh, with clients who have questions and then obviously get your questions answered and or also hey maybe you want to sign up for coaching, also cool, or join our school community, also cool, which is where most of this stuff is going to be posted in that school community. It's totally free, so like there you go, there's your there's your advertisement for the return. Anyway, all right, so if you hear some clunking around, I am currently in my studio, which is actually in the basement of my house, which is an upgrade or downgrade, depending on how you look at it, of my kitchen, which is where we had it before. So, anyway, it is about time. It's about time we got this back. This will be the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, or at least a tribute to the greatest podcasts of podcasting, right? So, if you got that Tenacious D reference, good for you. If you didn't, well, you're a big fat loser. So, all right. What are we talking about today? Right? What are we talking about today? Let's talk about the end of obesity, right? And in the school community, I mentioned today's topic was going to be how to simultaneously, that means at the same time, simultaneously burn body fat while at the same time, simultaneously, word for the day, building muscle. And most of the time you hear people say that and it's like, yeah, that's bullshit, dude. Like you can't do that. Like you have to pick a path. You're either building muscle or you're losing body fat, but you're not doing both at the same time. However, it is possible. You can do it. You can do this in the fight against obesity, in the end of obesity, but it will require a semiglutide to do that. So that's what I recommend is no, I do not recommend semiglutides. Side note, I heard a stat, and granted, it was on social media, so I don't know if it was entirely accurate, but I heard a stat regarding the use of semiglutides, and I got to get a doctor on here to discuss this stuff because it's super concerning that like 60% of all Americans, that sounds like a lot, is on some sort of semaglutide, or maybe it was like some sort of weight loss prescription drug or something to that effect. And I was like, that's fucking nuts to think that that many people are taking stuff like that, like semaglutide. I'm trying not to use the brand names, um, so maybe the six people that are listening to this actually hear it, and it doesn't get banned, um, or blocked or whatever. So, yeah, so, I mean, it was enough people are using it where uh, they made a South Park episode about it, like the end of obesity special, which was hilarious. Okay. Hilarious take on the use of Ozempic and Ozempic parties. Like, is that a real fucking thing? Ozempic parties that suburban moms are just shooting up left and right. Um, yeah, anyway, so like you got to remember with that, there's more and more people are saying that the weight that is being lost from use of those weight loss drugs, the semaglutides, is total body mass. It's some body fat and a lot of lean tissue, a lot of muscle mass. So are people losing weight? Yep. But they are losing all the weight, even the good weight. And that's going to have downstream negative effects. Like you can for sure count on that. There's no way that you can say, "Hey, I'm going to lose half my muscle tissue," and there's not going to be a downstream effect. Like especially in a profession that requires you to have said lean tissue for multiple reasons, right? All the good stuff that 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 your muscle does for you, right? Uh, you're just getting rid of it. Like that is not a good practice. That's not a good thing, right? If you think from the standpoint alone of like muscle is the number one primary place for glucose disposal, right? So that means like whatever like sugars you put in, right, is going to get converted into glucose, and then like a lot of it, bulk of it, is going to be stored in your muscle mass as glycogen, right? And that provides energy and all kinds of stuff. And protein has the same kind of effect. It's just a little bit different of a process. But if you do not have the tissue, your muscles will not be able to sop up that insulin, and then like in that, and it's gonna keep your blood sugar elevated, I would think. But you're not gonna dispose of it, right? So like I don't know. And there's supplements that you can take that are glucose disposal agents. So if you take them after a high carb meal, it'll help dispose of them. I don't know enough about them to talk any more intelligently, but um, anyway, the downstream effects of what we're going to see from the fallout of massive, rampant, um, irresponsible, I would say, um, prescription drug use and abuse. Because these things probably have decent uses. They probably are really effective for people that like need it. Like if you are super morbidly obese, and most of your body mass is body fat, then I would say, yeah, maybe, like my non-medical opinion here, like that seems like it would be reasonable. But if you have like normal-ish muscle tissue, and you're just trying to drop 20, 30 pounds even, like that's I I wouldn't say that would be your go-to. That seems ridiculous. That seems like it's not severe enough to want to risk the downstream effects of negative, like negative effects of this. Because I'm telling you, they're gonna be big. And it's just like the opioids, like, hey, we overprescribed all of these opioids, and all of a sudden we have an opioid crisis on our hands. And everybody that, if you're listening to this and you're a first responder, cop, fire, medic, like whatever, yeah, you've dealt with it. How many Narcans are we delivering every day? So this is not going to be that, but it will be something. It will be something. So don't get tied up into um, hey, this is going to be fitness in a bottle. It's going to be the end of obesity. It won't be, right? Last thing I'll say about that is, like, I can guarantee you it won't be, because if you just look at the history of everything, and any time somebody has promoted something for nothing, it's not how it works, right? That's not how it works. It's kind of like the movie Wishmaster, right? If you ever see the horror series Wishmaster, like, you wish for something, you get the thing, and then there are some horrible downstream effects, and people usually die and melt and faces explode and stuff like that. So that's what this is going to be. This is like Wishmaster. You're seeing Wishmaster play out right in front of your freaking eyes. So keep your eyes open. And if you are on the fence about using it, right? Man, I would make sure that you consulted uh, numerous doctors, right? Numerous medical professionals, and then people outside the medical field too. Talk to people that have been on it for a while, see what their effects are, see how long they've been on it, see what happens when they get off of it. Like, don't be a test subject for this, right? Don't be a test subject for this. Sounds like 2020 all over again. Like, don't be a test subject for this. It might be bad. We don't know enough. Maybe hang out a little bit, maybe watch, see what happens, right? So just a thought, right? And if anybody's got recommendations of doctors, or people in the medical field that know more about semiglutides, I would love to talk to them and see, like, actually get some legitimate medical information on this stuff, rather than, the social media confusion and, whatever. But it's just crazy too, if you think about, like, this is a whole nother topic, just how pharmaceuticals are pushed, and the routes that they go uh, to get in front of you as a consumer, because you are a consumer for pharmaceuticals. We all are. And it's crazy. So and so took it word of mouth, and oh, they had this result. Oh, I want to take it too. And then your doctor is, and, let's be honest, general practitioners are like they're doctors, but man, they're like, you talk about jack of all trades, master of none, and but they have all the same prescribing authorities as every specialist. So you could be getting specialized medicine with no specialized like treatment. So it's kind of like, is that really appropriate? You can talk about the same thing with hormones. Most family docs are not adept at looking at hormone numbers and really understanding like what those mean, right? So if you're looking at TRT or hormone replacement or something like that, you ought to go to a specialist. And I don't know why this would be any different. Because if you're just getting prescribed something, it's like, yeah, that'll probably work. That'll solve the problem. There's a band-aid for that, and see you later. Like, I don't know. Like, that's a lot of stuff. Like, it's not just a one and done. Like, this is a constant work, and you got to stay on top of it, just like hormones and TRT, stuff like that. Like, you got to stay on top of those numbers because they change, because you change, you know? So, all right. End of that. End of obesity. You guys got that down. All right. So, what are we discussing today? All right. So from a tactical standpoint, I think there's some stuff that is worth talking about. So like going back to the original topic, um, can you build muscle and burn fat at the same time? Yes, you can, and it does not require a pharmaceutical to do that. But how do you do it, right? How do you do it? Because it is difficult. It's a little bit more nuanced than just uh, picking a path, right? You either want to get lean and get shredded, or you want to gain weight. Like, one requires a caloric deficit, the other one requires a caloric surplus. It means you're eating more than you're burning, or you're burning more than you're eating. Okay. So obviously, if you want to lean out, you need to burn more than you eat, right? It's a simple-ish math equation. For the most part, now there is a lot of stuff, especially in stressful jobs and shift work, stuff like that, where maybe 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 here. And you might be in a deficit and might not be working right there. And that's when it's like, hey, it's time for blood work, that kind of stuff. So anyway, but generally speaking, like, you want to lose body fat, you need to eat in a deficit consistently. And if you want to gain muscle, that requires a surplus, right? And you're going to have a little bit of body fat gain with that typically. So now, how can you do it at the same time? One, the stars kind of have to be aligned. So you have to be like in a good place before you start, right? You can't be like suffering from, like illnesses and stuff like that. You can't be out of whack, like, um, with that kind of stuff. But here's what you got to do, right? You have to eat in high protein in a deficit. All right. And a progressive deficit where you're kind of dropping like, 10-20% at a time. Over time, I think works best, right? So that way it's not just a total shock, and it's like a progressive, just like wading into the waters with it. Plus then it's more effective and efficient too. Um, because like jumping into a 30-40% cut like isn't sustainable for longer than a week. You'll want to kill everyone around you, and then all of a sudden you binge, right? So like you get in this space where it's like, hey, I'm in it, I'm 100% all go, full send. And then it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work long term. And that's what you need in order to create that sustainable deficit, is you need it to work long term. And long term is relative. Like, we're talking like, 4 weeks progressively, 8 weeks progressively, and then get out, right? And that's, this is a kind of another conversation, but the best way to deal with a deficit is attack it aggressively, able to be sustainable, right? And then bounce out, right? And get back to maintenance. And you're in and you're out, and you're in and you're out, and you're in and you're out. And then next thing you know, like, you've spent enough time at maintenance and maintenance deficit, never in a surplus. And boom, losing body fat. Okay. All right. So how are we doing this? Right. We are eating requisite protein, right? So at least body weight protein and in a calorie deficit. So the way that we typically do things is we'll go like, I just use multiplier method. It's nice and simple. It doesn't require a whole lot of knowledge on like, you know, um, these other like base metabolic rate like calculators, stuff like that. You can find them online everywhere, but I just like the calculator method. It's very simple. We have a sheet, like a Google Doc that we can send you if you're interested, and it does it for you. You just plug the numbers in. So basically, like we say between 10 and 12 times your body weight, and then you eat grams of protein at level of body weight, right? Like 1 to 1.2 grams per pound of body weight is your protein level. That's going to take up most of your calories, and then the rest of it is carbs and fat, right? So you got to do a little bit of tracking here. Okay, the more tracking you do, the better it's going to be when you're talking about like wanting to, especially this, because you have to be pretty focused with making sure that you hit the protein level and stay in your calories. And if you do that, like, and your resistance training, right? You got to be resistance training 3 days a week, more or less, right? It doesn't have to be like killer workouts, but we got to be resistance training. You got to be pushing, time under tension and that kind of stuff in order to create the stress for the adaptation of muscle growth, right? And as long as you're getting the protein in, the muscle synthesis, the protein synthesis will occur. And if you're staying in a caloric deficit, then you will also burn body fat, right? So 3 days a week, resistance training, if you can tolerate it, if you're doing well with it, and then steady state cardio, man. Like that's a training, um, and that's going to be like 3 days a week, and like get up first thing you do, hammer out 20 minutes of cardio. Now what we're going to get into is how to do that and stay in the zones that you need to be in, right? Because this is important too. So from a dietary standpoint, like that's basically it. Like keep your protein at a requisite number, body weight, right? 1 gram per pound of body weight, 1.2, right? We don't need to go any higher than that. Even that's pretty high, but it'll get the job done. Um, and then from there, you just make sure that your calories are between 10 and 12x, depending on what your training is, right? Depending on what your training is. Um, you know, like 12x would probably be good enough if you're training hard. Okay. And then your resistance training 3 days a week, and you're hitting, 20 minutes of cardio, um, 3 days a week, right? That's 6 training sessions. You can do those same day. You can try to space them out. Like I wouldn't do one then the other. So you're training for 2 hours straight. Like this morning, I got up and did, 30 minutes of cardio. And then this afternoon, I'm going to do, probably 60 minutes of lifting, depending on how all my joints feel, which is day to day. So, um, so yeah, so try to space them out if you're going to do them on the same day, or you can do them on opposite days. That kind of stuff's fine too, right? But with the aerobic work, with the cardio, right? Aerobic and cardio is kind of synonymous. At least I use them as such. You're going to need to understand like zones or gears. Like I use the gear terminology. I just kind of like it better. It makes a little bit more sense to me. But so let's talk about those, right? Because we have to understand where you need to stay. And for the most part, like you really just stay in gear one, which is a low aerobic nasal breathing pace. Maybe gear two, which is a slightly more stressed nasal in, nasal out breathing pattern, right? And in these two, right, we're talking 5 total gears. So first 2 gears are nasal breathing only. This is important, right? Because base level, this is without like, hooking yourself up to machines and getting VO2 maxes and that kind of stuff. Like if you just want an easy, like rule of thumb that, like when you're breathing through your nose, you're in your aerobic system. And the fuel that your aerobic system is using uh, is oxygen, number one, and fat, number two, right? You're not touching carbohydrates, not yet. Typically, right? Everybody's going to be a little bit different with their metabolism, but typically, this is like generalized speaking here, right? Uh, you're going to be aerobic, and it's going to require oxygen for sure, and you're going to be mobilizing fat. Okay. Um, nasal breathing pace, right? That's important. The nasal breathing will keep a restrictor on your pace. Typically, when people do cardio, do steady state, especially if they're trying to get leaner, they go too hard, And if you get upwards into gear 3, gear 3 is like a threshold. It's a threshold marker, right? If you think gear 1 is easy nasal breathing, right? Where you're just kind of like sitting, just 2, 3 seconds in, 2, 3 seconds out. And then gear 2 is this zone 2 cardio. This is still aerobic, but it's a little bit more pressured. It's a little bit more. And then gear 3 is going to be, threshold, like nasal in, maybe nasal out, but probably mouth out, right? And it's going to be one that's going to be more pressured. So if you are staying in a nasal breathing pace, then it's probably going to be like you're snotting everywhere and stuff like that, which is fine too. I use that a lot. Not the snot, but the gear 3, right? Um, it's right at that threshold between aerobic and anaerobic, right? And you know, it's not bad to stay there, but if we're trying to just create like a depletion workout, or like, we're trying to deplete um, our our stores of energy prior to lifting, right? So it increases the deficit, right? We're creating a bigger deficit through movement uh, in order to, like, mobilize body fat, okay? Uh, then you don't have to be at that threshold level, right? You don't have to be. It's not going to help you really anymore. It might hurt you, okay? Um, because once we start getting into mouth breathing, then we start talking about, like, hey, we're probably utilizing carbohydrates more, and maybe we don't need to or want to, right? Um, it's also going to, when you start talking about like moving into anaerobic, now you're starting to talk about like sympathetic uh, nervous system response, which is stress response. Okay. When you talk about gears 1 and 2, that's basically lower aerobic system. You're not going to be stressing your nervous system as much. It's going to be more parasympathetic, more relaxing, right? And just getting your heart rate and cardiovascular system like mobilized to turn everything on and that kind of stuff. Um, but when you get up towards threshold, then you're starting to really stress your nervous system, which is great if you want to do that, right? The downside of that is, like, especially if you're training 6 times a week, right? Or doubling them up, then you're gonna stress the nervous system and your body with lifting later. Okay. Um, do you need to stress it again with cardio? Like, probably not. You probably don't need to. Plus, if you are listening to this and you are a first responder, a tactical professional, like, you have a life of stress. Um, so adding more to it usually isn't a good plan. It's just not a great plan, especially long term. So you have to manage that stress. You can't just go hard all the time and think like, oh yeah, the harder I go, the better it's going to be. That's not it. Especially like the older you get, like, especially, like, it doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. You will break. Right, you are um, rotting bags of flesh. Right. So the more stress you put on that into your 40s, probably late 30s, 40s, and into your even in the 50s and stuff like that, like, you just can't do it and sustain it. Like, very, very few of us can. God knows I can't. So you have to learn how to utilize volume appropriately, and that comes with intensity. Volume and intensity, those are knobs that need to be turned. But how do you do it, right? And I'm telling you, this is how you do it. Like, you modulate it with understanding zones and gears of aerobic system versus anaerobic system, and understanding what that does to your nervous system, right? All right, so we got gear 3, which is like a threshold, nasal in, nasal out hard. This is a very hard thing to maintain at a nasal pace, and it's basically your restrictor. This is your restrictor between aerobic and anaerobic. And once you start breathing out of your mouth, you're going to shift into your anaerobic, and it's going to start mobilizing more carbohydrates. It's going to start like increasing cortisol levels, that kind of stuff. So you just got to know what you're doing with it, and it's not going to be sustainable for that long, right? So you're going to start to burn out because that lactate threshold, because the glycolytic system isn't designed to go for that long. Like you're talking like 8 minutes max, right? With your glycolytic system, then you're shifting into your aerobic system, to your oxidative system. So like it's not going to be sustainable. Okay. Depending on how long of a training session you want to get after. All right. And then the last one is Gear 5. And this is mouth in, mouth out, hard as fuck. Limited use, carbohydrate driven. And, at this point, like this is not like if you're in Gear 5, it's for a sprint, right? It's for a quick sprint. And really the only reason you're breathing is to offload CO2, right? So as you do physical activity, CO2 builds up in your system, right? And breathing becomes more important to offload that CO2 and get that waste product out so you don't pass out, right? Rather than getting the oxygen in, especially if it's really anaerobic, really hard. Like think a 2 minute or 1 minute like grappling match or fight. 100 to 400 meter sprint. You're talking like 10 to 60 seconds of like full go. Okay. The only reason that you are breathing is to offload that CO2. So if we go back to Gear 3, the higher you can make that threshold of not needing to transition from aerobic to anaerobic, then your Gear 5 is going to be more efficient because you won't need to offload as much CO2. So you won't need to breathe as hard under extreme strenuous activities. And this includes stuff like fights at work, uh, run hot, to emergency runs, that kind of stuff. Like you won't go code black because you have a more robust aerobic system. So and that buffers out your anaerobic system much, much better. So yeah, so that explains the gear system, right? So if you got questions on that, you can send me a message and I can get into it. Or in the school community, we'll go into it further in depth if you want. You can really like piece these down per gear, per zone, and talk about like, hey, how to train in this particular gear for a particular reason. And all of that's going to help understand like your aerobic system, your anaerobic system, because it's not just a flip of the switch. It's more of a continuum, right? So it's like it's a continuum. You're never just one or the other. You're on the spectrum somewhere. Okay. Um, so yeah, you can really, really dig into this and really get nuanced with it, which is super cool. Because it's gonna make you better, All right, so how to fuel for optimum body composition, right? Uh, you know, again, we're talking about going back to kind of the nutritional protocols that I mentioned earlier. High protein, moderate fat, and then carbs needed for performance and stress. Like that's like I mentioned earlier, like you got to get your calories, know what your calories are. So 10 to 12x body weight. And then from there, you take your body weight and you just do that in grams of protein. And then, how do we navigate, fats and carbs? Okay. And really it all boils down to like moderate fats and carbs for as needed. And the harder you train, the more sprint work you do, jujitsu, CrossFit, like intervals, sprint intervals, that kind of stuff. You may need more carbohydrates in order to recover from that. Um, so where do you put the carbs, right? That's the question. Because your body's going to utilize carbohydrates in and around workouts way, way better than anywhere else, right? So you put those as much as you can after. Okay. If you're really concerned about performance, then you can put some before, and it's not going to have like a super bad effect. It'll help you. You'll feel better while you're training. But you want to put most of it afterwards, and that is just again, going back to that, like what do muscles do, right? Muscles soak that stuff up like a sponge, and it's going to put that glycogen right back where it needs to go, and it's going to help you heal and not be sore and that kind of stuff. So the more carbs you can put after training, the better. Okay. This is an extreme circumstance, but I heard an athlete one time who was an endurance athlete, and they were a full keto, right? Always checking, always making sure they're still in ketosis. And they were consuming 400 grams of carbs a day, which is heavy. That's a lot of carbs. That's a lot of carbs. Okay. But how are they doing that and still staying in ketosis? One, they were training like a motherfucker. And two, they were putting almost all of their carbs in and around their workout window. So that's gonna make sure that you do stay in that state, especially if you're training that hard and you're putting them all at the right point. All right. Um, yeah. So, oh, shift work, right? Let's talk about shift and stress. And like I said, you can't fight fire with fire when it comes to stress. Your body doesn't understand the difference between a hard workout that you did and a hard call that you just took, right? A fight that you got into versus an almost fight you got into. Like your body doesn't understand the difference, and you get that same dump of hormones and cortisol, neurotransmitters, all that. Whether you got into a verbal argument with somebody on a run, and you were like razor thin, almost got into a fight, versus you actually got into a fight. Your body doesn't know the difference. All it knows is that there was a stress, and I had to mobilize defense. Okay. Um, so if you have a shift like that, then you have to treat that like a workout. So if you start to use carbohydrates post shift, like that would be good. Okay, that's good. If you didn't have a super stressful shift and you didn't feel your nervous system ramping up, um, going sympathetic, going fight or flight, then maybe you don't need to worry about it as much. But if you did, then you do, right? Then you do, because you have to monitor those cortisol levels. And when you ingest carbohydrates, right, it spikes your insulin, and then that lowers cortisol. You got to think insulin and cortisol are on opposite ends of the teeter totter. Um, So chronically elevated cortisol levels will lead to inflammation and bad shit. But here's the thing, like you can't build muscle without it. So you have to have some cortisol. You have to have an appropriate level to create an anabolic environment in your body, but it can't be all the time because that won't work. That'll inhibit muscle growth. That'll inhibit what you're trying to do. So it's a balance, and so therefore you have to understand how to regulate yourself and how to understand like how to assess what state you're in um, during and after your shifts. That is huge because then that's going to dictate what happens with your training environment and your actual workouts that are going to occur before or after that, right? That's where it's like, should you train before shift? Should you train after shift? Well, that's up to you and your schedule and what you need to do. But from a nutritional standpoint, man, if you're going to train before shift, then I would say like you need to like really get some carbohydrates in and after your training session before your shift and then definitely again afterwards. So you're going to have 2 points of carbohydrate intake versus like I'm on day shift, so I use a little bit of carbohydrates towards the end of my shift because I know I'm going to train uh, right at when I get done with work. So that's going to prep me for my workout, and then I'm going to go big carbs basically all the rest of the night. I'm going to use up the rest of my carbohydrates, which is really only like 160 right now anyway, so it's not that much. Um, but that's what I do, right, for my shift. But that's where you need to look at your shift, your schedule, where your stresses typically fall, and then how to utilize carbohydrates within that realm. Okay, because it is a very effective tool, and if you don't use it the right way, then I mean you're basically like leaving performance and aesthetics and all this shit on the table. Like you're just leaving it there. So you can also use it for sleep, right? Because like carbohydrates are more of a sedative. So it's gonna induce sleep. It's gonna spike insulin. It's gonna help you fall asleep. Better than drinking yourself to sleep most of the time. All right. So let's see. Um, Carbohydrate levels. This is kind of last couple points we'll talk about here. Carbohydrate levels. 0 to about 150. You're looking at low. I would call that a low carbohydrate level. Um, and again, this is kind of dependent on what type of training you're doing, but this is like general rule of thumb stuff, right? 0 to 150. You're talking about low carbs. 151, I want one more. 151 to 300, that's going to be more of a moderate, right? 300 is pretty high, but if you're training hard, it can be more of a moderate. That's going to be more of a maintenance type thing, I would say, especially for me. Like I'm kind of gauging this off of myself, and the history of what I've done and what I've seen with my athletes. And then anything over 300, that's a high carbohydrate load. So you got to use it for what it is for, and understanding what the different macronutrients are for, what you can use them for, right, is going to be really critical. And then making sure that you understand, what your total calories are in the mix of all of this, right? And that's where it's like, having somebody that can help you through this is very helpful. So at least getting into like the school community where you can ask questions, or like getting into a coaching program, is very, very, very helpful in order to just close that knowledge gap. And it's like, all right, so counting macros seems overwhelming, but is it really? It doesn't have to be. Like you can get as nitty gritty with this as you want. But yeah, so if you're not in the community, get in it. If you are, then share it with other people, and keep growing this, guys. So trying to think if I got anything else. The kids are going berserk upstairs. I think that's all I wanted to cover. Yeah, that's it. So again, guys, thanks for listening. And if you got any questions, get into the school community. There'll be a link in the YouTube, and yeah, and you can reach me directly there. Okay. All right.